When the resume says Yale, Stanford, Harvard, and Cedar Sinai as past training and education, you can usually trust the opinion as it relates to their specialty. The exception is when it relates to yourself. Welcome to the Just Dumb Enough podcast, a show that acknowledges no one is always an expert by dispelling misconceptions with real experts. I'm your host as always, Colton Petrie. My guest today is Andrew Kadar. Dr. Kadar is a fan of the show with over 4 decades of work as an anesthesiologist. Despite all of this, he missed his own heart disease diagnosis until it nearly killed him. He's with us today to explain heart disease a bit, tell us some risk factors, and ultimately prove that his situation was not as unique as you might think. Let's not deny our own mortality. Oh geez, that is a dark way to start the show. Welcome to the show, Andrew Kadar.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on the show. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for the audience?
Okay, I'm an anesthesiologist. I went to medical school at Yale, did my residency split between Stanford and Harvard, Massachusetts General Hospital for the second part, and then went back to Los Angeles where I grew up and worked at Cedar Sinai Medical Center. I'd also been a gymnast and an athlete throughout my life. I'd competed for the UCLA gymnastics team, also ran cross country, ran lots of 10Ks, and was generally considered to be in very good health. One day, I was working out in the gym. I was having a workout on the elliptical, and about 9 minutes into a pretty intense run, I started feeling some burning right under the sternum, right, the breastbone. And I thought, okay, well, I don't have heart disease, but I don't feel well today. I'll just stop working out. A couple of days later, I'm back in the gym. And once again, same kind of workout on the elliptical. I feel this again. And I think, okay, now this is strange. I mean, I don't have heart disease. I'm in great health. So I stop. Pain goes away. Start up on the elliptical again. And this time in less than 2 minutes, I have that same feeling. So at this point, I sit down on the bench and I think to myself, okay, I don't have heart disease, but what would I tell anybody else who told me the same symptom history? And then the answer became immediately obvious, because this is the most typical presentation of coronary artery disease. Pain on the breastbone with exercise that goes away promptly with rest. And I take care of heart patients all the time. But when it was happening to me, my initial reaction was denial. Now, denial is very common in lots of things. It's common in cancer. You know, this tumor, it's not so hard, it's not so big, it'll go away, and then it grows and it becomes unresectable and incurable. Of course, in psychiatric conditions, people are in denial all the time. I don't drink too much. I'm certainly not an alcoholic or a drug user or what have you, and lots of other psychiatric conditions. But I think the best way to get over denial, and this is what I sort of learned based on my own experience, is to take it away from yourself. Because you don't have those bad diseases. You're too healthy, but somebody else could. And if you're giving advice to somebody else who has your symptoms, I think that's a good way to get over denial and get the proper care that you need. Now, when I first went to medical school, I thought that doctors routinely exaggerated the amount of time it took to get well. Because guys on the gymnastics team that I knew, they'd be told, oh, you'll be out for a month and a half. And they'd be back in the gym in 3 weeks and feeling just fine. And so I thought they routinely doubled the amount of time it takes to get well. What I didn't realize is I didn't have a typical sample. Because very healthy young athletes who are highly motivated to get back in competition are going to get well somewhat faster than average. But when I had this diagnosis, now after I had decided I needed a workup, I had the stress test, which was showed the ugliest EKG I'd seen in my entire life with abnormalities in every lead. I thought I'd need an angiogram, which would show what the blood vessels look like, and possibly just have one get dilated, and then I'd be back to work the following day. That didn't turn out to be the case. I needed open heart surgery because what it showed was three vessel disease with a blockage that's known as widowmaker because it causes sudden death so often. Now, mind you, there were lots of reasons why I shouldn't have had this. I never had high blood pressure. I worked out regularly. I was never overweight. And I had a great family history. My father lived to be 94, was hiking with him in the Canadian Rockies when he was 86. So having this was a total surprise to me and pretty much everybody who knew me. I think I caused a minor run on cardiac workups in West LA because everybody who knew me was, geez, if Kadar can have this, I better get checked out. But when I got the diagnosis and I knew I needed to have the surgery, I was still in my own mind this 20-year-old gymnast, and I knew I was going to get well faster and than anybody and better than anybody who's ever had this kind of surgery. Unfortunately, that didn't turn out so well either, because I had a bunch of complications, and I ended up spending more time in the ICU than average, and spending more time in the hospital than average. I did get back to work in about the amount of time that was predicted, and I probably could have gotten back a little earlier because I was feeling quite good long before. I mean, I was out for 12 weeks. If push came to shove, I could have gone back probably in 8 weeks. But the first few weeks were definitely tough, and I learned quite a few lessons from that in terms of how to get over some complications and how to communicate with healthcare workers. So it was an educational experience, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I wrote a book about this experience to help other people who might be in a similar situation.
Certainly. Well, when people hear the resume that you have and they're like, okay, I'm hearing top schools, I'm hearing Cedar Sinai. You had tons of training from some of the best institutes, colleges in the world. And yet, when it comes to our own health, you kind of tend to like avoid the bad thought because you're like, well, that could be a bad thing, but like it can't be in me, right? Like, and I think that's a very common thought in people.
Yeah, I think denial is something that you learn about in medical school, but I think everybody else should know about it too, because it's very common, and it happens not just in medicine. There have been people who, when they see a gunman running around, they think it must be a movie set, it must be an act, not for real, and even if it turns out to be real. People have walked into burning buildings because no, this I'm not seeing what I'm seeing, kind of thing. There was a famous incident in London when people were running out of a underground station, a subway station, because there was a fire, but other people were still walking onto the trains as they just, it didn't register that this could possibly be happening. So denial it hits you in a number of ways, but it's very common in medical practice. And it doesn't matter how brilliant you are. Steve Jobs delayed his cancer surgery until it was originally diagnosed at a stage where it was thought to be curable, but by the time he got sick enough and had surgery, it was too late to be curable. So you can be a brilliant person and still be in denial about your own health, your own mortality, but nothing like a major illness to make you think about your health and mortality.
Yeah, certainly. Well, and how many years of experience did you have between like when you started medical school and then had, this health complication pop up?
Gosh, let me think about that. That would have been 2010, so about over 30 years.
Because you've seen this before, probably fairly regularly, right? It's not like a particularly rare condition.
I mean, I knew all about denial. I knew all about how coronary artery usually presents. But when it happened to me, I knew I didn't have this. So I kind of wanted to write it off and now this will be nothing. It'll go away. And it's sort of a little bit of magical thinking, I think, that we all have about ourselves.
For people who are listening that have never had any, medical training or schooling or anything like that, when we say like heart disease or coronary artery disease, what are we really talking about? Like, what is it?
Well, there are different kinds of heart disease, but the most common is coronary artery disease, which is atherosclerosis, which is an accumulation of fat and calcium and other things that line the inside of arteries and making them narrower and narrower, cutting off circulation. And if you have it cut off completely, then you have a heart attack and heart cells die. I did not have that. I was at risk of having that, but I got intervention. I got to the doctor in time not to have that. Of course, if the same thing happens in an artery leading to your brain, then it's called a stroke. And if it happens in your legs, you can have claudication, or which is pain in walking, and finally you can have gangrene and having to have amputations. So it depends on what part of the body it happens, but it's the same process everywhere. It's atherosclerotic disease.
Well, and this is pretty common. I mean, at least in the US, like, having heart attack, stroke. I think those are all like in the top list of things that happen to Americans. So it's one of those that like everybody should probably know to watch out for it.
Yeah, and it's not just in the U.S. It's pretty much a worldwide killer. It's very common everywhere, but more so in developed and wealthier countries than in poorer countries.
Because I think everybody hears like, any kind of heart condition and they think like, oh, heart attack. And we had to be very careful to say like, no, heart attack is a complete blockage. That's the widowmaker, like is classically the heart attack that people just kind of drop dead from, whereas heart disease, like you've just got a lot of almost blockages.
Yeah, and not all heart attacks are deadly. I mean, they're not all the widowmaker, but it certainly many of them are, and they can cause arrhythmias, which are rhythm disturbances that lead to a sudden death. And sometimes you can have that rhythm disturbance without atherosclerotic disease. So that when you have a young athlete that drops in the middle of a basketball game, that might be an arrhythmia from a different cause.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, we already discussed like this is extremely common worldwide. How common is it? Like, do we have numbers that say like, oh, it's, X, Y, or Z?
We do have numbers. I guess I should have looked that up before coming on the show, but it's massive numbers. I mean, coronary artery disease is the number one killer in the United States, and I think probably worldwide.
Well, and I think that's important to frame for people that, otherwise don't know it, where they're thinking like, oh, maybe it's cancer or traffic accidents or, something of the sort. And you're like, no, this is the number one. Like, this is the biggest killer.
And a lot of it can be prevented by overcoming denial.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, aside from, the denial of it, you seemed, like you said, everyone thought you were very healthy. So what are kind of, causes or contributions that lead up to heart disease?
Well, there are, of course, things like high blood pressure, diabetes, overweight. Those are all contributing factors. But I didn't have any of those. So sometimes it's just bad luck. And in my case, I that's all I can lay it to. Once I had this disease, I went back to, is there anything in my past that could have contributed? And I did have high cholesterol for a while, but when that was diagnosed, I started taking medication that reduced it to a normal level. And it had been at a normal level for over 7 years prior to me having any symptoms. So I think getting checked out every so often is probably a prudent thing to do. There really, if I look back on my life, there isn't a whole heck of a lot that I could have done to prevent this that we're aware of. I think we are discovering newer things all the time, and there are some things that we've looked at since my illness that now doing, for example, trying to reduce markers of inflammation in the body and reducing cholesterol to an even lower level. But none of those things would have been apropos for me because part of the problem is that anything you take has positive effects and negative effects. So there's no free ride. In my case, I didn't immediately start taking medication to reduce cholesterol because at that time, and even now, those are statin medicines, and they have some side effects. And actually, the side effects have now been shown to be less common than when I was initially diagnosed, but they can cause problems with the liver and other situations that can be detrimental. So there's no matter what you do, there are some pluses and minuses. It's like exercise. It's definitely on the positive side, and the net effect is positive, but you can certainly get injuries. I know lots of people who have hip and knee and ankle problems because they run. On the balance, being a runner is a great thing, but you can't have injuries from that as well.
Well, and I think that's, everybody out here is looking for like the magic pill, right? They're like, just give me a wand that I can wave that says I'm fixed with no other side effects. And you're like, that's not how life works, unfortunately.
Yeah, we don't like that, but everything has its costs and its benefits, and you have to balance it to your situation, and obviously everybody's situation is a little bit different. But I think when you have a problem, it behooves you to try to communicate that clearly. So when I was recuperating, I had a number of issues that came up. And I think when you have a problem, it's very important to communicate with your doctors and nurses and tell them accurately what's bothering you. Now, I had, as I said before, I thought that I would have a very smooth recovery because I was in good shape otherwise, and I was motivated to recover rapidly. But shortly after I woke up and had my first meal, I had trouble swallowing, and every meal generated into an ugly bout with coughing and gagging and inability to swallow. And I was not aware of that. And there's the old thing that Donald Rumsfeld years ago said about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. To me, this was an unknown unknown, although once I got to talk to an ear, nose, and throat specialist, he told me that he was aware of this, that this does happen. It happens to a minority of people who have heart surgery, but it's known. And to me, it was very disturbing. I didn't know whether this was going to last. And once I had it diagnosed and told that this does happen, and I was reassured because the NT guy told me that he'd never seen it last for more than a month. So a problem that has a limited duration is easier to endure. And in my case, it went away in about 2 weeks. But when it was happening, it was pretty horrible to me. One of the known unknowns to me was that after heart surgery, you can have hiccups. Now, it happens with surgery in the upper abdomen and in the chest because you can irritate areas of what's known as the hiccup arc, which is diaphragm and the muscles between the ribs, the intercostal muscles. And if you have an irritation in that area, you're more likely to have hiccups. So after my surgery, I had a few hiccups. And I was told that it's probably from the drains. After surgery, you have some drains left in. Those are to allow fluid to escape that might accumulate inside the body. And as those can irritate, and as they come out, the hiccups should go away. And so I had the first one came out, and my hiccups got to be a little more. The second came out, and hiccups got to be a little more. This was disturbing to me, but I thought, okay, the last drain has to be the one that's causing the most problems, and perhaps it was moved when the others were taken out. When the last one was taken out, it was like the little Dutch boy's finger in the dike. I had hiccups like you can't believe. It was hiccups on top of hiccups. It was just a parade of hiccups, hic, 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 over and over and over. Now, when I was in medical school, I learned that, hiccups usually are just a minor nuisance. But people have had hiccups for months and years. Some people have even died from respiratory failure because their diaphragm became exhausted and couldn't breathe adequately. Now, today that wouldn't happen because you'd be put on a ventilator. But nevertheless, when I was in medical school and I heard about hiccups, the people dying from hiccups, it sounded about the same as the attack of the killer tomatoes to me. It just, who dies from hiccups? And I didn't think when this happened to me, I was no longer laughing. It was, now I didn't feel that this was going to be deadly, but it was just the number one miserable thing for me. And it took about a day and a half for my doctors to find a medication that was effective for it. Because, there are a number of ways you can stop hiccups. And usually, the ones that I tell my patients, one is swallow some grainy sugar because it irritates the back of the throat and it can interrupt the hiccup arc. But with my swallowing problem, I couldn't swallow anything rapidly. On top of that, one of the other things is if you stretch and swallow rapidly, that can stop hiccups. But with a chest incision, I wasn't allowed to raise my arms above shoulder height. So that was out. So we were down to medicines, and the first medicine that my doctors tried, nothing. Second medicine, a little bit of help, but not much. And finally, they gave me a medication that was also a sedative, and so I went to sleep for about a day. And or at least I could be aroused, but I was just very sleepy the whole time. I think one of the doctors was talking to me, and he stopped in mid-sentence, and I said, "No, my eyes may be closed, but I'm listening." But it looked like I was falling asleep, and my wife said, "Well, it looked like you were about to fall asleep." So then we kind of had to back off and titrate the medication so that I would be awake, but still have the enough of a suppression of the hiccups. And over time we could reduce the dosage and eliminate it altogether. So there is a solution, but at each stage you need to talk about and clearly let your doctors and nurses know what's bothering you. But I want to say that there is one positive aspect to all this is that I had a lot more time to think. I have a busy schedule. I had to be at the hospital by 6:45 in the morning every day. Operations can last a long time, but now I had lots of time to think, and it does give you time to think about your life and what you want to do, what you're happy with, what you want to do. And, in my case, I wanted to get back to my normal life. So I did everything that I possibly could to do that. But I also thought, can I do something positive with this experience? So one of the things I decided is that I would try to be more positive to the other people in my environment, to compliment them more, to thank them more. It's not that I wasn't doing that before, but I thought that ratcheting up that would be a positive thing. And so I have tried to make that effort since then. And the other thing is, I thought that I would communicate about my experience because I learned a lot from this. And that's why I wrote a book about it that's called Getting Better.
Well, and number one, my worst nightmare is having hiccups forever. That is like the thing that scares me most for some reason in the world, other than the fact that I do think one day I'll die laughing, because I know that's like a very rare thing that has happened in history. But sometimes I've laughed so hard at something, I think like, oh, this is it. We're about to die. But there's a lot in there that like, trouble swallowing or hiccups or, like stomach pains, problems going to the bathroom, like any of those things could just happen, in association with a surgery. And if you're just thinking like, well, this is my issue and not a medical issue, we kind of get back into that same thing from before where you're like, you're denying the problem. Even though this is like, well, I had the problem solved. Okay, well, this is a new problem. Hiccups is a new problem. Inability to go to the bathroom, that's a new problem. Like those things happen to people. My grandfather actually just got out of the hospital from open heart surgery not long ago, and that was his big thing. Is he's like, I have a lot of trouble in the bathroom. And I'm like, okay, well, that happens to people, but like talk to a specialist because you don't want this to be like an unresolved issue.
Yeah, fortunately, that was not a problem that I had, but I had, everybody's case is going to be different, and you have to deal with what you have. And I think the stresses of an illness can pile up on you, and it can also pile up on your caretakers. I think one of the things that you have to remember, and I was very aware of this, is to be kind to your caretakers. They're trying to help you, but you need to be reasonable with them. So in my case, I mean, there's a thing called caretaker exhaustion syndrome, and it just becomes too much when you're having to do lots and lots for another person. So after I got out of the intensive care unit, Cedars allows one family member to stay in the hospital overnight with a patient. And it's in a narrow cot that's not particularly comfortable, and there are lots of noises. And my wife decided to do that the first night. But between the discomfort of the narrow cot and people coming in to take my blood pressure, draw blood, and the other noises of the hospital, she didn't get much sleep. And so we decided that it would be best for her to go home, get a decent night's sleep, as good as she could under the circumstances, and be in better shape. It would be better for me and her both because she'd be less exhausted and better able to help me. And at the same time, it would be better for her because she'd be less exhausted and be able to do the things that she needed to do. So we were very aware of that. And I think a crisis like a major medical illness can bring a couple closer together, or it can drive them apart. Fortunately, in our case, it actually brought us closer together because I really appreciated everything that she was doing for me. And she said she admired everything that I was doing to do my level best to get well as rapidly as possible. But when I was having trouble swallowing, she went out of her way to make some very delicious soups so that I could have because liquids were easier to swallow than solids. So we actually, I think, learned to love each other more during this process.
Yeah.
And I think that was a positive thing.
No, absolutely. I mean, you could see how it could be otherwise a stressor, somebody that is taken by surprise at their sudden illness and then they're hospitalized and they just, understandably, I think to an extent, they have kind of this like, woe is me moment. And maybe they're confronting their mortality or, dealing with a sudden illness and the change of their lifestyle. And they kind of just let that thought consume themselves. And the people around them, like, want to take care of you. People care about you. They want to take care of you. But if you're kind of like an eternally sad, mopey, unmotivated person for a long time, that is extremely draining. And I could see how that would take tolls on relationships as well.
Yeah, and I think the strain of being ill does sometimes have a patient doing things that they would otherwise not do and perhaps later regret. I had one situation, one morning I woke up and there are various bands that are put on patients. You have your name band, but there are also other bands. If somebody is has difficult airway, they might get a band for that. And I woke up one morning and I saw fall risk, a band that said fall risk on me. I looked at that and I said, fall risk? I'm a gymnast. I have great balance. I'm not a fall risk. What the heck? Who put this on me and why? And the nurse said, well, it must have been the night nurse because we don't know. I said, well, I'm not a fall risk. And I said, look, I can stand on my tiptoes. I can stand on one leg, and I demonstrated on right leg, left leg, on toes. The nurses were saying, no, you're gonna fall. I said, no, I'm not gonna fall. I'm not a fall risk. And now, most people couldn't understand why I was upset about this. It's an innocuous band. It did no harm, but I'd been in the hospital for over a week at that point, and it seemed to me you lose a lot of your autonomy in the hospital. You don't have the same freedom to do things that you want to do, and think of it like if a musician was had a band on his wrist that said tone deaf. That's the way it felt to me. Now, I later found out that this was put on all patients before they go to surgery because under anesthesia, you might be involved. Now, it should have been taken off a day or two into my hospitalization. And I wasn't aware of it because it had been something new that the hospital initiated shortly before I had my own surgery. Later, when I got back to work, I noticed that all my patients had that. So I kind of blamed the night nurse the night before on something that I just hadn't noticed before. So yeah, in retrospect, that was an overreaction on my part. Well, only a little one, but nevertheless.
No,
And
of
most
course.
people wouldn't have had that reaction. But I think everybody can be subject to something that's particular to them. That in other circumstances they would just laugh at fall risk, not me, and walk away. But since I was restricted to my hospital area, it just seemed like something that needed to be taken care of urgently.
Well, and I think that's like personality types, right? If you're a very active person like you are, like my grandfather is, you don't want to be like stuck in your room, in your bed, whatever it is. Like you want to get up and just move on your own, go do your own thing. And they're like, no, like you need to sit down and rest for a while. And you're like, I don't want to rest. Whereas some people might be like, I don't have to get up. Cool. Like they might be
Well,
fine with that.
actually, nowadays we do tell people to get up right after surgery or shortly after surgery because you don't want, if you stay sedentary in bed, you can get clots in your legs, and those clots can travel to the lungs and called a pulmonary embolus, and that can make you quite sick as well. So it's important to move and walk. And so I very much from the first day on was very much into walking. And in fact, I was chewed out one time because I'd walk too far away, and according to the physician assistant who was checking up on me, I had walked away from the range where the rhythm monitors could follow me. I don't think that was true because none of the nurses talked about it, but it's important to get up and walk, but obviously you don't you need to limit it to an appropriate amount. And afterwards, I went to cardiac rehab, although I advanced that along a little faster than the rehab people wanted me to do it. Again, my personality to some extent.
Exactly. No, I mean it really speaks to the like autonomy loss that you have going through a very severe medical condition and a surgery and everything else. I know my grandfather's biggest complaint about being in the hospital, and I was like, is this really like your huge issue? Is he's like they would bring him in the food menu and he'd be like, okay, this is what I want. And then they'd go like, oh, actually, we're watching your salt. You can't have that. He's like, okay, well, how about this thing? And they'd be like, oh, actually, we're watching whatever this is. And he goes, why don't you just take this back, cross out everything I can't have, and then come back to me? And I'm like, you've lived like you were in Vietnam crawling through brush with no food, and this is your issue now? And he's like, well, it just bothers me. I'm like, all right, I get it, I guess.
Well, again, sometimes you might focus on things that in retrospect aren't all that important.
Yeah.
And but I think to some extent it comes back to be reasonable. And I think patients are given slack in some situations, but it's something that a patient should think about as well. Everybody's human, and you need to respect the people who are helping you. And your goal is perfectly aligned with the goals of everybody else. Your doctors and nurses want you to get well as rapidly as possible. It's good for the hospital's reputation. It's good for your doctor's reputation. And out of humanity, they want you to get well. And of course, you want to get well. So everybody's interest is 100% aligned. So I think sometimes patients treat caretakers, and then I get that on the other side as somebody to be hostile against. But that makes no sense because we're all aligned in the same direction. And if a patient gets well, everybody's happy.
Well, I mean, it really is like leave it to the experts. No matter what you're doing, right? In life, if there is an expert for your thing, kind of leave it to them. Like, I'm not going to do my own house electricity because I'm not an electrician. Leave it to an expert. I'm not going to backseat driver my surgery because I don't have any experience in that world. So, I tend to do that, I think, to an extreme in that, like, most people usually go, like, do you have any input on this? And I'm like, no, you're the expert. Just do whatever you want. And they're like, okay, I guess you have zero input. A lot of people want that control. Like they're desperate for that control, especially after, a life risking event where they're like, oh, I could have died. Like they want to feel in control. And this is not the time for it. Like this is the time to listen to the expert, to sit down and just take their lead.
Well, the amount of information that people want, it can be very different. And a lot of people are kind of like you, just do what's best for me, doc. But there are others who want to know what can happen. And usually, there are lots of discussions on what's the best thing to say. And usually my philosophy, and I think a lot of doctors' philosophy is, if somebody asks, you tell them the most common complication. But you can't tell every single complication. Can you imagine describing all the complications that can happen when you cross a street? The street light might fall on top of your head while the car hits you, while lightning strikes, while whatever. It's endless. And the ultimate complication, anything and everything you do in life, including getting out of bed or staying in bed all day, is death. But you don't have to say that to everybody when the odds of it are very small. So when you're having a little biopsy or hernia repair, I don't tell people they might die. I think it's a possibility, but the possibility is infinitesimally small. You wouldn't do anything if you thought about, if I step off the curb, I might die. You're going to stay on the curb. But if you stay on the curb, you might die too. So I think you need to be reasonable in how you describe it. And the amount of detail that people want varies quite a bit. And there are those who just do what's right for me. And there are others who want a little bit, and there are others who want lots and lots. And I think it behooves us to answer questions, up to a certain degree, but at some point it can get ridiculous too.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. It's kind of one of those like death is always a non-zero possibility. Just sitting here for the rest of eternity, there is a somewhat chance like I am going to die from a freak accident. But, again, like you just want to know like what could happen likely. What are like the top three most likely things if you want to know, maybe that's the thing to ask. Because otherwise, yeah, an expansive list, like you want me to stand here for the next hour and list all the things that might happen? Because I could do that, but it's going to not help you or me.
I think what helps is to describe what to expect and what you need to do afterwards. And one of the things that I was told before surgery is that I should get up the first day and walk as much as I can, not going to exhaustion, but definitely walk around enough to limit the chances of having thrombophlebitis, the clotting in the legs. Well, actually, that's inflammation, but to limit having clotting and to also not have muscle atrophy along the way, because you don't want to become weak over time. If you stay in bed for a long period of time, you're going to get weaker and less able to get back to your normal life as rapidly as you can.
Well, and I think everybody has one of these stories, right, where they know either they've been in the hospital and they've recovered, or, if somebody they know has been in the hospital and then recovered. The thing we don't really talk about is what life is like post recovery, where you're like, I have recovered as much as I'm going to, or 100%, whatever it might be. What's life been like for you after this?
Well, fortunately, my goal was to get back to my life. I enjoyed my practice and I wanted to get back to that. And I like traveling and I definitely wanted to get back to that. I like hiking and there are lots of mountains in the area near where I live in Southern California. I like to go on hikes. I like to bicycle. Used to play tennis, but now more pickleball. So I wanted to do all of that, and so my goal was to get back to that. And fortunately, I was able to get back to all of that and went back to work full time. Last year, I was hiking in Rwanda to see the mountain gorillas at 7,000 foot altitude. So I've been able to do that. There are, of course, illnesses where you can't entirely do that, but again, you need to make the best of your circumstances. And fortunately, I didn't need to face that ultimately. But if you do, then I think at each point, it's a situation of what can I do to make my life as good as I possibly can.
And assumably, of course, with you like on the show right now, you probably talk about heart disease much more than you did prior to having, it happen to yourself.
Well, I'm much more aware that it's a real possibility for me and other. I mean, of course, I knew that it was the most common cause of death in the United States, and it was a very big cause of hospitalizations and limitation on activity. So yes, I was very well aware of that, but I was also, I think a lot of us think of ourselves as fairly immortal, and so I kind of did prior to this, and now I'm somewhat more aware. I mean, of course, I knew I wasn't immortal, but nevertheless, I didn't think about the totality of my life in the same way that this essentially forced me to.
Well, and
And
that
I
could
think,
be a big realization for people because, we do kind of have that like, well, I'll die when I'm 90 or whatever thought in your head. And then, something major happens to you at 25 and you're like, oh no, I might not make it to 90. And, whatever age that happens at, I think that's a really kind of critical turning point for a lot of people that realize like, hey, there's things I still want to do or stuff I still want to get around to. Maybe I need to make some major changes, or maybe I need to, go advocate for something that I believe in.
yeah, some people say, well, you should live your each day of your life as if it was your last, which I think is silly because you wouldn't be taking a class that's going to last 6 months if you think this is your last day. But nevertheless, I think it's a good idea to think about the totality of your life and what's most important in your life and what you want to accomplish for sure, and what can wait, and so to prioritize things that are important and maybe put on the back burner things that are less important. I think to some extent that this experience helped me do that. Not 100%. I still probably waste as much time as everybody else, but nevertheless, having that in the back of your mind that prioritize things that are really important, write down the stuff that you want to get done, do the things that you want to get done, say the things to your loved ones that you want to say. I think those are important things to keep in mind, and that you don't regret that if, for example, a relative dies and you didn't say some things to them that you wish you had. So I think take the opportunity to say what you can, or do what you need to, or do what you want to, while when you have the opportunity to do so. So I think having a major illness does put some of life's goals and arc into a different perspective.
Yeah.
It certainly did for me, because I thought, hey, I'm from a family with longevity. I'm doing great. I have no illness, but there's a possibility of a time crunch for anybody.
Well, and that comes to, say what you need to say, write what you need to write. You've written a book now about this. Tell us what kind of spurred that on for you.
while I was recuperating from this, I thought, okay, I've really learned a lot from this experience. I didn't want to learn all this, but I did. And I think it would be helpful for other people to get this information. I think could be helpful for people who have a major illness of any kind, particularly heart disease, but really any kind. And it would also be helpful for their loved ones, because there's sections in this book that are basically things that my wife told me. So it's her story about a variety of things. One of the things is that I was actually relatively newly married at the time, and my wife is Chinese American, and she remembered hearing the tales of a woman whose husband dies shortly after their marriage. She's labeled a super scissor, and somebody who could never marry again. Sometimes they were ostracized, and sometimes they were even punished for presumably. So her goal was to get me well, so that nobody would think of her as a super scissor. And now it's been another 14 years. And by the way, I've had no cardiac symptoms in the last 14 years. So my book is kind of a hopeful book, because it shows that you can get back to your normal life, and you can have a good life after a major illness, after a life-threatening illness.
But yeah, I mean, it sounds fascinating. Make sure people can find it if they're looking to read it. So where can they find it?
Okay, well, of course, it's available in some bookstores, but on Amazon, it's called Getting Better, A Doctor's Story of Resilience, Recovery, and Renewal. And I also have a website, which is based on the title of the book. It's Getting Better Doc, D-O-C after Getting Better, .com. So gettingbetterdoc.com.
Fantastic.
So get some additional information on that.
Yeah, and we will put those links in the show notes. So if you were looking to buy that book or visit the website, they'll be right down below wherever you're listening from. Dr. Andrew Kadar, thank you so much for being here. This has been super insightful, and I really have appreciated your time.
Colton, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
As a side note, I've had multiple family members now actually require heart surgery, and a few of them have passed away from untreated conditions. So I'm trying to stay very aware of my own risk. I would hope you're all doing the same, keeping yourselves in good health for a long time to come. In other news, September is well underway, and here's the updated rankings so far. Number 1, the United States, taking back first place thanks to New York, Texas, and Illinois. Number 2, England of the United Kingdom, rocketing back up the list. Number 3, Australia, with Victoria now holding a small lead over Queensland. Number 4, Canada, with Ontario maintaining a healthy lead. And number 5, Ireland, tied with Ghana. What a race. That's it for this week. Have a great week, a great weekend, and I'll see you all back here next week for another new episode. Until that next episode, pretty pleased with all those things that help the show grow, like rating, reviewing, liking, and subscribing. Remember, you can reach out to dumbenoughpodcast@gmail.com or on any of the social medias if you want to reach me personally. But most importantly, stay dumb.